Hello, everybody. My name is TJ. I'm the Director of Operations and Partnerships at the Elections Group. For anybody who is joining us for the first time, the Elections Group is a nonpartisan election administration consulting firm that partners with state and local election officials, as well as other stakeholders, to implement new programs or improve processes. We're a team of election experts who support election professionals through collaboration, thought leadership, and elevating best practices. In our shop, all of us have worked in election offices, so we know firsthand the challenges faced by election officials, using our real world experience to help folks solve the challenges that they face. I am very excited today to have both Paul Gronke and Paul Manson with me. They do excellent work through the Elections and Voting Information Center, or EVIC. I have three favorite days every year: Christmas, my anniversary, and the day the local election official survey goes out. And I only say one of those in case my wife is listening in. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gronke and Dr. Manson to give brief intros of themselves, and then they're actually going to jump into a short presentation on their findings before we move into the discussion portion. As always, I encourage folks to use the Q&A function as we go. All right, Doctors Gronke and Manson.
TJ, thank you so much, and thanks to the Elections Group for having us here. I think we last saw each other at the NASED meeting in Washington, D.C., so it's great to touch base with you and speak virtually. Of course, meet person and many of our colleagues, but speak virtually and share more of our findings. My name is Paul Gronke. I'm the director of the Elections and Voting Information Center, co-located at Portland State University and Reed College. I'm also a professor of political science at Reed College, and I'll hand it off to my colleague, Paul Manson.
Yeah, thanks again, TJ. I'm Paul Manson. I'm a research assistant professor at the Center for Public Service at Portland State University and the research director with EVIC. And just really thrilled to be able to share some of these findings from last year's survey. Paul, I think we can just have me start with the first set of slides, and we'll do a handoff there partway through. And so for folks who aren't familiar with EVIC, we're a nonpartisan research team really focused on election administration and working to amplify the voices of local election officials around the U.S., both through our annual survey of local election officials, as well as some other projects. Right now, we're running a series of interviews across the nation with local election officials to explore organizational structures, budgets, and workforce dynamics. So, Paul, we can start in slide 2. Let me just share with everybody, this survey is been a growing process over time. We started in 2018 with the first local election official survey. And over the past 6 years, this has gone from maybe a narrower set of questions to a much more comprehensive survey. And this year was the first time that we included a number of academic partners and practitioner partners around the US. Those partners are listed here on the slide, and they shared some new sets of questions, primarily focusing around public records requests, concerns around motivations for public service, or what brings people to this work, and some questions about ethics, as well as what's the experience working in this sort of increased skepticism, denialism environment. And so these teams are working on subsets of questions. We'll talk about some of them, but actually some of the findings will be coming out later this summer as these teams do some further work on their research. We've got a web address here for where the survey lives at. Paul will talk a little bit more at the end of the presentation about how you can access these data and how you can use them for your work. The next slide. All right. So we're going to start out talking about what's the work like today. And so we've got a number of items that we've been asking over the years around job satisfaction, workload, and retirements. So a key story we want to hang on to is that 2020, when we first started asking, actually 2019, we first started asking a series of job satisfaction questions, but in 2020, we added a little bit more of a nuanced way to explore that. And we had a high watermark there. And it's sort of interesting to make sense of what was going on in 2020 that sort of shared this real strong sense of job satisfaction. It has declined into the 2022. We took 2021 off as a year, so that's why that year is missing. But it's dropped down to this lower level. Something we're not going to show here, but we're exploring right now is sort of where those shifts are occurring. And one of the pieces we found is that it's the job satisfaction is recovering in larger jurisdictions. The smallest jurisdictions continue to have lower and lower job satisfaction. So there's an emerging story here about some of those challenges between the different jurisdictions. So that previous slide I shared with you was an overall question: how satisfied are you with your work? We know in survey research that some of those big questions, folks can have sort of a tendency to answer, it's fine, don't worry. So what we want to do then is follow up and probe with some more narrow questions, really see, are you really satisfied? Are you really okay? So here are a subset of 5 of about the 15 that we ask along those lines that share with you that we've got a decline in some of these constituent elements around job satisfaction. The top level 2 items here, I'm proud to tell people about the work I do and that I'm respected by county officials, is either flat or a decrease. Still good numbers, we're near 3/4 in this current year, but of course that's come down. These next 3 is where we start to see a little bit more alarm, and this is the question about, can you balance the work-home priorities and can you leave your problems at work? Balancing work-home priorities has really come down quite a lot. And so in another slide we have later on, the workload is really ramped up over the years. This is telling us that stress is starting to make an impact outside of just the professional life. And the last question is a unique personal question. We ask local election officials, would you encourage your child to go into this work? And back in 2020, most said no, only 41% would encourage their child to go into this work, but that's just cratered since. So now less than 1/4 of local election officials would encourage their child to go into election administration. That one really sort of caught our eye as sort of, that's a good gut check. How do people perceive this work and the future of this work? So I hinted at this. Workloads have really jumped up. This slide captures a question we like to really explore, which is this recognition that many local election offices, right, share multiple duties, whether they're recorders, whether they're auditors, whether they're doing budget or city council work. Not everybody's 100% elections. In that smallest set of jurisdictions with less than 5,000 voters or less than 25,000 voters, we really see that division of duties. And the difference between non-election periods and peak election periods is drastic. There's 9 times sort of more effort on elections in that election period. So you've got offices that essentially don't think about an election at all and then suddenly have to do everything around elections. And so that's a source of stress. But even at the top, the greater than 100,000, it's a big jump between those periods. And we don't share this in these slides, but we know when we ask our respondents about their workload, we ask them to report how many hours they estimate they're working for how long, and it's easily approaching 60 to 80 hours a week for 6, 7, 8 weeks at a time around the election. So just a huge increase. The election calendar has gotten longer. And so what does that mean? What's the impact on local election officials personally? So a lot of news has been out around turnover, especially around retirement or departures from office. What we do is we first ask folks, are you eligible to retire? And if you are, what are your retirement plans? We've been asking this question since 2020. The eligibility number is about the same over that time period, which is telling us that folks are leaving and folks are entering the profession sort of at either end of that career pipeline. So that number is stable and the cohort hasn't had a big change. What has really moved is that we're now seeing far more folks saying they're going to be gone by the next presidential election. So in 2020, 45% said they would depart before the next presidential. Now it's 56% are willing or planning to depart from the election service before the next presidential election. So stories around that turnover are real. Folks are self-reporting that they're on their way to walking out of the job if they need to. One of the other parts of this survey, we ask individuals to, if they don't mind, share some of their comments. And as we go through those comments, we get some really interesting stories around what the work looks like. And I apologize for folks who are online. Obviously, we're all online. This is a lot of text. But let me just highlight a couple of key pieces. This clerk is sharing that 1/3 of their state's clerks have departed from the profession since 2020. The job is a lot, and the assistant budget is very small. So there's not a way to handle all this work. This is a great example of a small jurisdiction where the local election official is also managing dog licenses, business licenses, marriage certificates and licenses, and then some particular town-specific pieces. A big piece we've been hearing from the smallest jurisdictions is a need for just the time to do trainings. So I think there's been a lot of great work being done talking about training and training modules, but folks in those smaller jurisdictions simply don't have the manpower, the staffing to close the window, so to speak, at the front desk and participate. So now we want to talk about hiring and retention recruitment, what's happening in the workforce. So hiring, like many parts of the economy, is a hard thing right now. So 2/3 of our local election officials in the survey share that it's more difficult now than it was a few years ago to hire. And some of the big challenges continue to be this lack of experience or the particular skills for election administration. Those are the biggest barriers. In our interviews, we're hearing a lot about how on-the-job training through election cycles really is maybe the most effective tool. And so a lot of election officials are then looking for other types of skills that they know are transferable or good substitutes for that lack of experience or lack of specific election skills. And so these soft skills come up as a real barrier as well. Local election officials are looking for individuals who are able to think on their feet, handle maybe a bit of a combative public, handle those requests at the front door, and work well on a team under pressure. And those are skills that are missing in the applicant pools. And that's what we're hearing in the surveys. For themselves, local election officials are really not planning for their own secession yet. Only 32% report having a plan. Many of those that don't have a plan cite that they don't have the time to think about it, or they feel like it might be someone else's responsibility, or that it's too soon. And those are some interesting barriers. So hiring permanent employees, as we mentioned, it has been harder. And this is to give a sense of what that looks like. Really, no one's saying it's gotten easier. A third say it's about the same difficulty. 2/3 are really saying, hey, this is a challenge. It's much more difficult as a quarter. And just to capture some of the pieces out of those earlier bullets, this is a breakout. We ask them to tell us what are the main barriers. And you can see here that these are drivers. One thing I will note, and this is a good piece, is the very bottom line. 8% are saying, hey, we've got some generally qualified folks coming in the door. Okay, so that's some good news. It is only 8% though. And this gives you a sense of some of the challenges. If we want to help local election officials on the recruitment side, it's thinking about how we can help with those particular skill gaps. One of the pieces that's also been a big driver on stress for workload has been the rate and pace of change on the policy or administrative rule side of things. That's created new workloads for local election officials or having to rethink how they staff new election cycles. And so this is a great quote we heard from one of our respondents about, if you're going to keep ramping up this workload, they being either the legislature or the state election office, through expanding voting methods, we need to figure out how to better compensate or staff up more effectively and find the right type of staff who can do this work because of the new sort of environment everybody is working in. So at this point, I'm going to hand this off to Paul Gronke, who will share a bit on the legal, regulatory, and public record side of things.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So we're going to highlight one policy spotlight here. We have additional ones that we're going to be rolling out, but this is some great work that came out of the journalism school at the University of Florida. So they are working under support of Democracy Fund and trying to understand how election officials are managing burdensome public records requests. So they have additional work that's going to be rolling out, and we actually have a brief right now. I'm going to highlight it in a few minutes on our website that just came out last week. And they're doing work in addition to the survey. The survey provided them sort of outlines of the problems nationally. And this confirms what most of the election officials who are on today's webinar understand, that it's not public records itself that's the problem. It's a small number of highly burdensome or, even inappropriate requests that are occupying a lot of their time. So that's the bad news, and I think a lot of officials know this. Everyone in the community has heard this. But I think we think this is good news. That is, the officials aren't asking for ratcheting back public records requests. They're not asking for punitive penalties. What they're looking for, when presented with a series of potential solutions, the ones that election officials nationally endorse are ones that would make things easier for them. That if you are coming in with a request that it forces the official to do a lot of work, you need to pay for that. Roll out technology to officials to make these things work better, and really educate those citizens or people that are making the request. And you notice on the right-hand side of the slide, the things about fines and bans. Officials do not endorse those kinds of solutions. Really, they want to make things easier. So we think this is a good news story, and the kind of thing really that state legislators should be looking at right now to make these easier. These are not hard solutions. Of course, technology is going to be an initial cost, but it's a kind of thing that should be able to be maintained over time. Second thing we asked about, this is with some work that we began with Dr. Joseph Anthony, who's at SUNY Cortland, investigating how election officials sort of work with the state legislatures in their states. This can be a sore point for some officials, and it works really well in other states. So 3/4 of officials tell us that there's been some new legislation in the past 2 years that impacted how they do work. But only 1/4 say that these changes have really, in their opinion, helped election administration. So we're hearing this a lot in the follow-up interviews that we're conducting with election officials. They want to partner with state legislatures. They particularly point commonly to state associations as a way for them to work productively with state legislatures. But a lot of times we're hearing, far too many times really, if only these state legislatures would talk to us, at least help us help them understand how these changes may impact election administration. The last thing I'm just going to talk about quite quickly here is some work that David Kibble and Yuval Lian from the University of Missouri St. Louis, they're going to be rolling out a policy brief in about a week, 2 weeks, about public service motivations. We have a series of questions. You're going to find out more about this, but again, this is from our open-ended quotes, but you will be pleased to hear, TJ and others, that while there are rough patches that election officials are navigating, we are still hearing very high levels of interest, commitment, excitement about the work they do. Local election officials and their staffs want to be able to navigate through this world. They need some navigation tools, but we're not seeing huge levels of erosion in their commitment to doing the work that they do. These are some policy spotlights, some things that are being rolling out. We've rolled out the first one already on reforming public records. Next up is public service motivations. This job satisfaction that I talked about already, Paul referenced. So these are going to be rolling out over the next month or so. Last thing I want to do, closing here, TJ, is help folks on the call and the webinar if they want to learn how to navigate our website. We're pretty easy to find. You just search elections and voting information, you'll find us. This is what the report page looks like. If you click here, you get our report, which you can page through, and there's a PDF that you can download. What a lot of people really find useful if they have the time and they cross their eyes are the code books and crosstabs. These are all of our data going back to 2018. I want to highlight with folks what will happen. Like, let's say, for example, you want to know a little bit more about the question that we asked about the state legislatures. So if you click on the crosstabs, there's a navigation bar on the left. You can scroll through the questions. And I've highlighted here exactly the result that we showed above, that only 1/4 of our respondents say that the changes in their state, and look at that, here's something that election officials mainly agree with, that state legislatures are not necessarily helping things. The last thing I want to show for those influencers like TJ here, we've innovated this year and put our infographics out on a place where people can get to them. So if you click on this link, you can pull all the infographics out from our report. We'd love if you report back to us when you see those infographics and use them so we can kind of track the impact of the report. We've got a QR code here if you want to jump right to that page. Our contact information. I'm going to leave this up for a moment while I close, but TJ, that is our presentation.
That's really excellent, and thank you for giving us that. I'm a little curious, kind of moving back, the nuts and bolts of the process of doing the survey. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like, when it begins, when folks do it? I know many folks who are on this call have likely participated, but if they haven't, can you just give us a rundown of what that looks like?
Yeah, TJ, the process for us, it's about 6-7 months in sort of a run up to get the survey collected. What we start out with, and this was a huge lift by Paul Gronke this year, is, how do we mail surveys out to local election officials? And so we've been fortunate. A few years ago, we had some really smart students who helped us out with some tools to help scrape websites. We pull EVES data in. We've got contact lists for local election officials. One thing that's been interesting over time, of course, is phishing attack and cybersecurity concerns have ramped up. A lot of websites and directories for local election officials have become guarded or limited in terms of how you can programmatically capture those. So that takes a lot of effort on our team to create that list. And then we pull a sample from all of local election officials that's based on the size of jurisdictions. One of the challenges is if you were to just simply hit the whole list, everybody who's a local election official in the US, you would probably hear mostly from the smallest jurisdictions because that's the biggest group out there in the US.
You actually hear mainly from Michigan and Wisconsin.
That's right.
New England and Texas.
In Texas, yeah. And so
Yeah.
And so this sort of varying political geography across the US is a real challenge for us to be careful about, because if a survey is just sort of sent to everybody and we start reporting national means, as Paul was saying, the national mean may just be the story from Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of New England, and Texas. And so we're real careful about how we do that. So we do a sampling approach that we capture basically everyone who served a jurisdiction of about 15,000, 20,000 voters or more. And then we have a probability sample for those smaller ones based on how big they are. Once that's done, then we start with the invitation for an online survey, which we did this year beginning in August. We do that for about a month, and then the folks who haven't gone through the web link, which is a pretty sizable group this year. I got, for the first time, I had a lot of inquiries from local election officials who were either contacting my president's office, like, is Paul a real person here at Portland State? Or who found me through LinkedIn and then messaged me like, are you a real person? What are you up to? Or a phone call. Hey, I need to talk about what you're doing. Which I love. That's great. I'm happy that offices are really scrutinizing this and not just clicking on the links. For folks that don't respond online, then we mail a survey out, and that goes on for another month. So this year, our response rates tend to be between 25% to 30, 31%. This year, we tried something new. We were closer to the election to sort of see if we could get a little more current news. And I think that decreased our response rate a bit. We're down, I think we were at 22, 23 this year, which is great compared to peers, but a little bit lower, I think, because we got closer to the heat of the action. But I'm glad, because I think we're also getting maybe a more frank assessment of where the world's at, because we saw sort of how things were working.
Yeah, TJ, I want to chime in just two quick things. One, the metaphor that I use a lot presenting it is, imagine you want to understand the experience of the average college student in the United States. If you sample my own school, Reed College, which has 1,200 students, and you sample, I don't know, the University of Florida or Florida State, which have 50,000 students, you can't sample them with the same probability. So we have to, Jay Lee was a graduate of Reed College who helped us work this out. It's a process called enterprise sampling. It's used often in sampling industries and other things where we have very differential size units. The other real interesting thing we noticed this year is that we had concerns about the web survey. People said, I can't respond. When we sent the print survey, then they went back to the web. So they kind of didn't believe us until they saw. And I just want to stress again that we're not doing gotcha questions. It's not an accounting device. I know the EVES, the Election and Administration Voting Survey of the EAC is so important and valuable, but it also is time consuming. Ours is not meant to be time consuming. We've tried to keep it below 30 minutes. We originally promised 15, I think, when we started, and there's just too much interest in the community and asking. I think in 2020, we got a little bit long, but 2020 was a year, right? And there were a lot of questions and concerns about COVID preparedness. So yeah, it's interesting. Such a diverse community, as you know, TJ, and when you're trying to hit small counties in West Texas and large urban jurisdictions and sprawling suburban jurisdictions, it's tough to ask questions and assess and the election community in a way, because it's so amazingly diverse.
Definitely. And I think for folks who are on the call, you've heard Michigan, you've heard Wisconsin. I think the number is there's like between 8 and 11,000 chief local election officials in the United States. Michigan and Wisconsin alone account for about 3,000 of those. So to give some context to what the polls are talking about, you can see how that would impact data.
I mean, the example, TJ, for a lot of people, again, is in the sampling world. If you do a random sample in the United States, you're going to have too many, you'll have an overrepresentation. As you're flipping a coin, it's very likely to get overrepresentation of Florida, Texas, California, New York. And so they do something called stratified sampling that most people may have heard of. You sample within regions and even states randomly. It's sort of the same thing that we're doing here.
That's awesome. All right, I've got some questions about, I think, the data that you all collected from this, and I think we'll talk about the good and the bad. And I know we talked about job satisfaction, we talked about hiring, or you talked about it in your presentation, but is there a single most surprising piece of data or finding that you had from the survey? Either Dr. Gronke or Dr. Manson.
Well,
and I will say once, I'm sorry, we do have someone who's asking if, I think you got to the question about contact info. All good. Sorry. Go ahead.
there's a couple of stories here, TJ, and I'll let Paul jump here in a second too. But the key thing for us, I think, is that because of how the election outcomes occurred, there's this appearance of calm and success and a well-run election. It was, but that potentially is papering over a lot of stress. And so I think one of the pieces we were really curious about going into this election was if it had been closer and we had these stressors, boy, what would that have looked like? But in a way, maybe just we're fortunate that the results were clear and early. And so a lot of the worries that we had out of previous election cycles didn't shine a spotlight on some of these workload stresses, the potential turnover impacts, and then some of the staffing challenges.
Yeah, single. That's hard, TJ. I have so many things I want to learn more about in the study. I guess I would say the single one that surprised me most is one of our partners, Dr. Lisa Bryan, is a Carnegie Fellow from 2024 to 2026, trying to understand, along with Dr. Mara Sutman-Lee at Connecticut College, they both were funded to try to understand the ongoing impact of 2020 on the elections workforce. And Dr. Bryan is a very good friend of ours and collaborator, and asks some what I thought would be very tough questions. I worried that election officials would not respond to them, frankly, asking about election skepticism among different communities that they interact with. And the good news is somebody trusts us. I think it's our respondents, and they responded. They responded and they gave frank assessments. And that, yeah, Paul, we had a lot of back and forth with Lisa on those questions. We felt like I really worried that people would not answer them, but they did. And so Lisa's going to be writing about that in a couple of weeks, and then she's doing that work. Going to be doing follow-up interviews with election officials, just try to help them navigate, understand how they navigated that world, which really was very, very difficult. So yeah, my big surprise is people trust us. I hope they did. They did.
I'm going to actually turn to the Q&A because I do see a question here that I think is a good one, which is, some of these trends over time, I think are trending negative. People compared to 2018 are less satisfied with their jobs. Are there positive anecdotes or positive pieces of data to pull from this to tell a story of a resilient profession?
Well, I think a key piece to hang on to here is that Paul had mentioned some of the questions that were in the job satisfaction around public service motivations. And I think that strong commitment to public service is just, it continues through, and that will drive that resilience. Those are sort of an intrinsic set of values that keep people coming back to the work. And that's great to see because that sort of tempers some of the turnover worries. We hinted at this too, the job satisfaction is varying across election sizes. And so I think one thing we've been trying to figure out how to put our finger on, because we've had a hunch that there are maybe 2 or 3 LEO stories. There's the very large jurisdictions that are well-resourced or have access to more resources, and they're showing a lot more of that resilience. So the recovery and the job satisfaction is much higher. They have ways to recruit or maybe better advocate for funding. And then the middle jurisdictions that are in this sort of transition space, they're going from being a smaller, maybe face-to-face sort of organization to a little bit of a larger jurisdiction with population growth. They're experiencing some growing pains. Technologies don't quite pencil out. They can't afford maybe make the jump to the next piece of machinery. Their physical spaces are outdated. And so that's a different set of stresses. And then the smallest jurisdictions here, even within those, I bet there's 2 stories. One, they're able to just sort of brute force it through, right? They can do it with 1 or 2 people, work all night, you get done, you get 8,000 voters in that election. You can sort of make that happen. But another set of the small election officials are the ones in the job satisfaction are really saying they're just sort of over this. There's too much stress. So the positives here are we really see that dedication, but we need to pay attention to these different types of offices because that resilience story will vary based on the size and location of the office.
Yeah, I would say, TJ, on the work, and people look through the series of questions that we call workload change. How has your workload changed 4 years ago? And folks tend to highlight, say, public records requests. Everyone's saying it's gotten a lot worse. But there is, when these are sort of rank ordered, and we should probably present this, Paul, but signature verification, voter, things where officials tell us there's less work than in the past. Signature verification, voter registration, some of the back end stuff where I think technology has improved. We are seeing folks saying that things are easier than they've been in the past. So I do think that that's along with what Paul said. There's another interesting one that we're waiting. Dr. Leah Maravaki and Mara Sutton Lee are going to be looking at on the misinformation front. LEOs in large jurisdictions are still wrestling with this, but in the smaller jurisdictions, there are a significant number that's saying things have improved. And so that's one of those cases where we need to dig a little bit deeper into the data and pull out those areas where things have gotten better. They're not as bad as they used to be.
I don't know if you're able to pull it up quickly, but I did see one of the pieces of data that showed folks or election administrators, election officials they believe that their positions or their jobs are viewed more favorably or with I don't remember the verbiage that was used by other partners in government. And I think that that's a really key piece that groups like the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, which have facilitated partnerships between law enforcement and election officials or other parts of government and election officials. I think that's had a meaningful change. I don't know if you go any deeper on that or want to remark on that at all.
No, that's right. The question you're referencing is we have one where we ask if their work is respected by other county or local officials, that sort of horizontal local government interaction. And it is real positive. I think overall we have almost 80% sort of say they agree or somewhat agree that they're respected. And that's there's actually a little bit of a U shape there. Again, the smaller jurisdictions, probably smaller governmental units, and so they have more of a face-to-face. They really report that. It dips a bit through the middle-sized jurisdictions, that's sort of 25,000 to 100,000, and then it just skyrockets through the big jurisdictions. So if you're a larger jurisdiction, you really feel like you've got some good partners. So smalls and larges sort of have this better relationship. But still, the dip, so to speak, is down to 70-ish%. So it's not enormous. I will say that, I also want to not minimize that there are 10 to 15% reporting that they don't feel respected. And so we want to be careful here that averages don't obscure a concern that might really mean something in some jurisdictions. And I think a lot of those dynamics play out when it comes to, I see some of the questions in the Q&A here, really comes to, budget season. If you don't have good relationships with your board of commissioners or your county government, when it comes to submitting, a request for another FTE or to buy a ballot sorter or refurb a building, that worry, that disrespect or not disrespect, but lack of respect or equality in the perception is going to limit funding opportunities.
One thing we worked with a jurisdiction last year, and the election director there mentioned that she was for the first time invited to the county's emergency management meeting. And this is a mid-sized county in the Midwest. And she said she showed up at the meeting that she was invited to, and she sits down, and the person she is sitting next to asks her, Sally, what are you doing here? Which I think, you could view that in two ways, which is obviously that's not a good interaction, but it's also probably, it is the first time that she's had a seat at that table. And that really feels like an opening to greater respect across government. So I kind of see examples of that just through our work.
Yeah, TJ, I want to follow up on that and something that you had asked earlier. We have been privileged in this work, particularly this year. The funding that we received from the Elections Trust Initiative and Democracy Fund, as well as another project we have with the Bipartisan Policy Centers, allowed us to do a significant number of follow-up interviews, more than we've done in the past. And we have heard from a not minimal number of election officials on the hiring side that have said things have gone okay. We're trying to navigate through what those patterns are. It's hard on the individual interviews not to kind of dig into the individual circumstances. It's hard to back away. In our own state in Oregon, we did a report a couple of years ago, and what was evident was that not every rural county was struggling. Some of the rural counties that either had data centers that had arrived or ports or other things had allowed them to get sufficient funding. The ones where we really struggle on our own state are counties that had historically relied on natural resource extraction. For us, that means trees, but some in mining as well. And they were having real difficulty. So there is a real plus in digging down as you've done, TJ, and talking. The other one I want to share is one more recently. I'm not going to give anything away here, but some may know the individual, so hopefully I won't give too much away. But this is an individual in their state. They developed a leadership program that is now rolled out statewide. And this individual shared with me how valuable that leadership program was. It's at a county level leadership program. And it allowed that individual to connect with all of the other administrative leaders in their county. And I was just, what's the right adjective here? I was extremely impressed with how effective that program has been for this individual and I suspect for others in that state. Because, you know, we have asked questions about there's a question we ask about how's the budget conversation going? And we're always pleased to hear officials tell us it's gone great. I have great relationships. But there are some officials that are multiple levels down in the system, and you're asking for TJ Pichet is, say, a city administrator or a county administrator, and you're asking for this $50,000 ballot sorter or more than that. And TJ is like, what is that? I don't know what that is, Xing it off the budget, not realizing that that's going to result in more accurate, more efficient, fewer staff. So yeah, we need to dig down at times, and that's what we've done. I think we've dug down and that kind of nuance is just so important for us to kind of flesh out these findings that we have.
And you're obviously talking about the other TJ, so that's okay. I see some questions in the Q&A related to compensation.
Yeah.
I don't know either, you know, through the survey or through some of those more focused interviews, what you've heard from folks both about their compensation as the chief election official, but also the compensation of the folks who work to support them and support voters.
You bet. So, you know, this is one of the challenges we have with the survey where we've got sort of items coming on and off every year based on sort of the excitement out there. So normally we ask a question about, are you satisfied with your pay? We didn't ask it this year just because we made some room for some other items, but we asked last year and we've been asking for a number of years. And there's, you know, generally speaking, it depends on the size of the jurisdiction. So overall, about 35–40% say they agree that they're satisfied with their pay. A quarter, you know, take it or leave it, neither disagree nor agree. And then another sort of 30–40% are disagreeing that they're satisfied with their pay. So again, real split responses almost equally across those sort of three directions. Satisfaction goes up as jurisdiction size goes up. So the larger jurisdictions have more resources and they're reporting higher rates of pay satisfaction. The smaller ones don't. So that's a real dynamic. So the other question around on the hiring side, absolutely. I think we have a hard time exploring this in the survey because it gets into details that we don't want to be too burdensome about. But in the interviews, and I think a lot of us have heard anecdotally, job classifications are out of sync with the work. And because they're out of sync with the work, they're out of sync with the compensation studies or the compensation models. And, you know, we've heard this at the top and the bottom. You know, we've spoke with clerks in states where their county does a comp study and the consultant that comes in says, oh, you're a clerk. Well, that's just sort of moving paper. They compare it to another private or public sector job that's like that versus, no, this is a constitutional officer who's interpreting critical voting rights laws. You need to move it up. So that's been a challenge. Absolutely. Compensation has been a barrier in a lot of states as well. And I think part of it is a challenge of communicating what public service compensation looks like. So thinking about the full total compensation, benefits, retirement. So some younger workers obviously look first at the salary number and sort of ignore the rest. What that means is there is an interesting dynamic I have heard in some places where we have somebody who's maybe getting towards the end of their career. They have another 10 years or so before they can retire. And it turns out it would be really good to be in government work for retirement purposes. And so there is a potential sort of non-traditional recruitment pipeline that's not looking at younger workers, but looking at workers that are sort of in the middle or late stages of their career, thinking about how election work might be their last job, and having them come in so they can finish up their retirement components and do some public service work as they work towards the end of their career. But it absolutely is a barrier. You know, we have one local election official who's just sort of very straightforward with us. The In-N-Out burger pays more than I can for entry level. And so in this job market, you're competing with a lot of wage inflation across the board.
There's there's good work coming out, TJ. You may have sort of heard this through the Project Grapevine, but there are at least two, maybe three projects that are working in sort of allied streams on learning more about the compensation and staffing and workforce issues at the staff level. I'll just echo what Paul said. And whenever we hear in some of our interviews that there was a county compensation study, we try to follow up and get it. Those appear to be quite valuable. The other sort of secret sauce out here, again, a lot of the folks on the call are going to know, human resources offices are really critical. And, you know, in some respects, I try to say at the state and even at the federal level, stop talking to the election officials and start talking to the human resources officers. Because in many places, the election official, we've learned, really has very little control over the hiring. They're bound by county rules, and the human resources officers, I haven't dealt a lot of them with them personally, but I don't want to say that anyone's not doing their job well. I just think they've gotten out of sync, as Paul said, and they need to be educated. And the way to do that education, I thought in Oregon, we talked about this, Paul Manson, is try to connect the Oregon Association of County Clerks with, we have an Association of Human Resources Officers. And until we did our staffing study a couple of years ago, I don't think anybody had thought about connecting those two organizations. I'm like, you have to. We have examples in Oregon of really successful hiring, but it's not shared, TJ. It's like one county or another county does a good job. I'm like, hey, roll that ad out. Talk about not just the pay, but the way the work is, the benefits, the other things. Talk about those things, and figure out a way to try to recruit perhaps a little bit broadly. Last thing I'll say on this, TJ, and you know this, Paul knows this, a lot of election offices do their recruiting. Paul's word, he calls it, but localized, place-based recruitment. And folks need to understand that in a lot of places, if you're only recruiting within your county and you're a small county, it's hard. It's hard to do that. So in a way, if you can expand that recruitment network, nobody wants to lose good staff, but that's also a success, right? It's a success when somebody that you've trained and mentored moves on to a leadership position somewhere else. But we have to try to foster that kind of behavior, I think, a little bit better. And human resources offices, I just think are key here.
Awesome. I do kind of stepping back. I know we've talked about election official job satisfaction. You all have this great data. Dr. Manson talked about that breakdown of, 40% of folks are satisfied with their compensation, 30% of folks want it to be a little better, whatever the data was. How does that compare, or are you able to compare that to other levels of government, or are there similar efforts like this for law enforcement or for libraries or for those types of other functions of government?
Good question, TJ, and I don't have a straight answer for you right now. Yes, there are surveys out there for workforces. One challenge, I think, right, you're asking sort of this classic question I'd always have my students ask, so what and compared to what? And, for this, we do need to sort of do some ground truthing on that. And the challenge is a little bit is finding some consistent national models and what's a good comparator. So, are county executives a good comparator? That's a bit of a challenge. One of the problems we wrestle with is remembering, right, half of local election officials are elected officials themselves, and the other half are civil service or appointed to some degree. And that's a real different set of environment. One of the things I've noticed is I think the pay satisfaction tends to be reported higher in some ways by electeds. And I think that just reflects sort of maybe some attitudes about their perception of how much an elected official should be paid versus what a career person would be paid. That said, we also know among elected local election officials, they often tend to lag compared to their county counterparts. If it's a county commissioner or a county judge, those positions will pay more than the clerk or auditor recorder sometimes. And so there is that dynamic. So I think we wrestle a little bit with what is the yardstick to compare here. I think a lot of us, if we were asked about our pay, are probably going to say we wouldn't mind getting paid more. So there's always a little bit of bias in those sorts of spaces, but we do need a better reference point, I think.
Okay, Paul, you got more to say on this. Come on, I'm going to ask you a question. TJ, there's a lot more that everyone can do. I think the scholars and researchers, the onus is probably primarily on us. We need to work harder at this. But Paul, there's some like I'll use the term EEOC. Can you say a little bit about that, or some of these other
Well,
surveys of county governments, other things?
that's so there, that you're thinking. I think that's a diversity set of questions. The what I tend to look at for comparators, the Conference Board does some polling of private sector and public sector jobs. The OPM, Office of Personnel Management, and the federal side has this, state national viewpoint survey that's done of all federal workers. So we've used that sometimes as a comparator, but I think in terms of thinking about from a pay perspective, compensation perspective, finding a solid comparator is still a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, but sheriffs, law enforcement, education has always been on the radar of these broad national data collection enterprises, TJ. Election officials have not.
Yeah.
And so we, as a scholarly community, perhaps support of the elections group and others, need to put pressure on some of these data collection enterprises. Say, look, you've got to ask about election administrators. I shake my head on this, TJ. I'm perhaps part of the problem in my trajectory through political science, where my discipline did not pay much attention to election administrators for all of my career, really, until the last 20 years. But yeah, we know a lot about sheriffs. We know a lot about school boards. They simply have not been asking. It literally, it's not in the list of questions that are being asked, so we don't have good comparative data. We need to do that so we can answer exactly the question that you asked us.
I encourage folks, we've got about 10 minutes left. I encourage anybody who has one to put a question into the Q&A function. I am going to pull one of those out that I see Dr. Gronke answered. I will remark that the two of you are the fastest Q&A written answer folks that we've had as participants. So thanks for that. But I am going to ask, similar to anonymous attendee, are there any trends that are emerging now that you think the community needs to keep an eye on over the next 5 years? I see the start of an answer from you, Dr. Gronke. Can you expand upon that?
Well, the one, I will go both. And I'm going to leave the first part of my answer to Paul Manson because he is the one I think has highlighted this. We think this is true, and since we only think it, I'll let him hand wave. The second one I said in there, yeah, my colleague, Michelle Schaefer, I know, is watching the webinar. So I have this assignment to write about the job satisfaction because that has been such an impactful finding when we presented it. People want to know a lot more about it. And so the first thing I did, which we always do, and we recommend anyone who work with our data do, is look at the jurisdiction size breakdown to make sure that there's not a pattern underneath that is impacting the overall results in a way that you might be saying, this is happening to community overall, but it's actually being driven by a subset of the community. And when I looked at those numbers a couple evenings ago, Paul will testify to this. I sent him a late night email and said, I've met something's wrong here. I need to check my work. I'm going to be writing on this. It'll be out in a couple weeks, but the job satisfaction numbers have declined overall, but they have sort of collapsed for the small jurisdictions. They've gone down after 2020. They're continuing to go down. And this is a concern for me that this large set of LEOs who are comprise such a large proportion of the community. And as I think everyone knows, are the officials who, on the one hand, are less stressed because they can do things the old-fashioned way manually. But on the other hand, all these new burdens and expectations have been placed on them, and they often don't have the resources. So that concerns me because we hear anecdotally, and we're trying to make sure we have systematic information that certain states with large numbers of small jurisdictions have experienced very high turnover rates. And are we still going to see those? And some of those Midwestern states are also battleground states, and they can continue to be battleground states. So if we continue to see really high levels of turnover in Wisconsin and Michigan, and they're also battlegrounds, that's just a pain point that I'm worried about. I was worried in 2024 and Michigan and Wisconsin got it done, but I worry about those states. The state offices are doing great jobs there, sort of connecting those. But man, TJ, that is hard, right? I mean, there are a lot there that Michigan and Wisconsin themselves sort of a way reflect the diversity of this country, not fully racially, but in other ways. People just don't understand unless you really look at that community, how much diversity. On the generational shift, Paul, you got anything to?
Yeah, TJ, I think an open question, sort of this is the crystal ball for me, is are we seeing maybe a generational transition within local election administration, where we have the good news is, right, with this turnover, we continue to see replacements have a depth of experience. They're reporting 70 years of experience as they come into these. Is this a turnover that is part of what's going on? And because we do speak with some of the younger, newer entrants to local election administration, and this environment is the normal environment, and so they embrace it, they take it on with a certain energy. I feel for folks, there was sort of a social contract 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when you got into elections, that it would be one type of work, and that social contract has shifted as we've done things differently in their politics. So we may be seeing that as a transition here that's driving some of these. The other crystal ball piece, I mean, obviously, one other thing I just really nuts and bolts were about, our survey started out in 2018 with a focus on really simpler, I feel like, challenges back in the day, cybersecurity, sort of those sorts of misinformation campaigns. I worry that for the next 4 years, those may be off the table from a federal policy perspective. I'm hearing about sort of how some of the cybersecurity resources are being wound back potentially. Will elections no longer be considered critical infrastructure? What are some of those larger national policy shifts? And do states and associations have the capacity to backfill the departure of federal resources when it comes to something as important as intelligence and security? That's where really even a well-resourced state can't stand up a similar set of tools that federal agencies have been able to provide.
Right, Paul, let me just say, and something as relatively low end as having a .gov address or having dual factor authentication on some of your services, there was a lot of progress made, but we don't want to slow it down. I'm very concerned with with what's going on with CISA. That we think we've made all this progress, but in fact, when we first measured this in 18 and 19, I remember having conversations at NASA about some of our findings, and some of them were encouraging, but some of them had Amy Cohen, the executive director of NASA, saying, and it's like, well, that the messages didn't get to everyone. We've got to double down here and work harder on some of these jurisdictions that we're not sure even some of the people who responded 18 understood some of the terms. TJ, what we did is we pushed out the kind of EAC and forgetting what was the other agency that made a set of cybersecurity recommendations, kind of rolled those out and saw how many. And you get this sort of split in the community where lots of people said, of course I'm doing all that, but others are like, what is that? I don't know. Now that's gotten better, but to completely ratchet back on that, that's a real concern for me.
I'm gonna try to weave our last two Q&A questions together, successfully or unsuccessfully, and we've only got 5 minutes left. But the last question we have is, what opportunities do you see right now? And I'm going to turn this into a leading question by mentioning your data shows that only 35% of local election officials they are very confident that votes were counted correctly nationally. The Q&A section, I think this is an excellent quote from Paul Burke. These are experts who lack convincing evidence from peers. So I don't know if you all want to offer just briefly, what can organizations, what can election officials, what can academics be doing to bolster that or raise that number across the community?
Paul, I know you've been opining on this one. I think I'll hand that one to you.
Yeah, again, I don't want to keep saying there's good work coming, but there's really excellent work being done. Some partnerships with Arizona, Texas, California, Dr. Thad Kauser at the University of California, San Diego, Dr. Charles Stewart at Metzl. They have a major initiative. They've had some, rather than just having election offices produce videos or materials to try to communicate to the public, they've been really testing those in kind of a field experimental way. They've been showing that tours work. I'll point people like Dr. Thad Kauser, Kousser, University of California, San Diego. They've been rolling out some really good work showing what works. The other one I want to highlight is the our group, our institute.
R Street.
So R Street has been doing some great work. engaging with elected officials. And I think and the National Conference on State Legislatures, Wendy Underher and others have been doing really great work with state legislators who are on sort of the election committees. I really think that's the point, the leverage point here, TJ. Associations need to have good relationships with state legislators, because it's hard for an official to counter something that they're hearing from an elected official who has a much bigger megaphone. So I think that's the point. I think a lot of us, besides the workforce issue that we're talking about, I think a lot of us are realizing or have realized that state associations are incredibly important. We need to strengthen them. We need to figure out ways for state legislators or others to fund them sufficiently. We need those to be robust. Election officials, community is so important. Networks are so important. The elections group does such a great job with networking, but we need those networks to be vital and functioning in every state, so officials can speak with one voice, and be able to elevate their own voices, I think, state and nationwide.
In 30 seconds, anything that we missed, anything that you want to cover, starting with Dr. Manson? Oh, who's muted?
Who's muted? Just to really capture Paul's point, I think the key piece here is in this next era of sort of federal engagement, states are going to have to play a different role. And so whether it's associations or state election offices, that engagement needs to happen, especially because legislative activity has been so keyed up around these broader national trends. So things that can help take pieces off election officials' plates would be great, but ask their permission first, because a lot of them have ownership over some of those pieces. And I would hate to see some help come in that was a little too quick.
Yeah, TJ, counties need to step up to their constitutional responsibilities if they're there to fully fund elections. They should not be relying on title or recording fees. We've talked with some states that have a model that I don't know, TJ, I'd ask you to close on this if you can, but we've seen some states where the officials are able to essentially bill the state and city and municipal governments for places on the ballot. And I've heard other states where say, if only there was this model where we could charge people for space on the ballot. I don't know, TJ, that seems like a way forward to try to roll that out in more states. I don't know if that's so controversial, but boy, in the states where we've heard it works really, really well.
Yeah, I'll quickly remark that, if one stream of revenue comes that can replace a different stream of revenue, then maybe that's what happens instead of just having multiple streams. So, but I think all of those ideas are excellent. I am going to close with a final question, which does not require an answer. As you all continue to work together, Paul and Paul, I don't know if you've considered changing either one of your first names or maybe both. But maybe folks might appreciate it in the wider community. Thank you to both of you for being here with us. Thank you to everybody who joined us for the conversation. I encourage folks to continue to come to our webinars. I'm going to put a link right now to our Civic Roundtable page, or one of our Civic Roundtable pages. If folks would like to join that, continue the conversation in that space, please do. But until then, we look forward to seeing you at our next Elections Group webinar. Thank you, Paul and Paul.